Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I am Kent Shesky, and I serve as the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, or CAST. We are very pleased to share our most recent CAST commentary on goals, strengths, and limitations governing the use of life cycle assessment, LCA, in food and agriculture. As noted on the agenda, we will have a question and answer the panel of our authors from the commentaries task force after our main presentation. We'll open up the chat box for questions related to this topic a few minutes in advance. CAST is a nonprofit 501c3 membership supported organization comprised of scientific societies, companies, nonprofits, universities, libraries, and individual members. CAST was formed in 1972 at the recommendation of the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council. CAST board is comprised of representatives of the scientific societies, agribusiness, and nonprofit organization. It is through our network of members and supporters that we select our topics for CAST papers and access volunteer scientists, economists, engineers, and other subject matter experts who help produce these papers. Over the last 14 years, over 1,500 professionals have graciously volunteered their time, energy, and expertise to serve as authors of our task force or reviewers who ensure each is unbiased and based upon sound science. I'm excited to share that CAST is marking its 50th anniversary this year, commemorating half century of communicating the science, technology, and innovation of so critical to the future of food, agriculture, and natural resources. The observance of this milestone began in October of this past year with the release of a new publication focusing on CAST past, present, and future impacts. The CAST board is also planning a series of presentations, listening sessions, conversations, and other events to be held in various locations. The culmination of this anniversary will be at the CAST annual meeting in October. We'll be sharing more details through Friday notes and social media in the coming months so you can participate and celebrate with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available later through our website. Toward the end of our presentation, we'll post a message that the chat box is open to you and to submit questions for our panelists. The task force chair for this paper is Dr. Marty Matlock, professor in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department at the University of Arkansas. His research focuses on technologies and processes to increase the resiliency of ecosystem services in human-dominated ecosystems. He has also recently accepted a position with the USDA Marketing and Regulatory Programs as Senior Advisor to Food System Resiliency. I'd now like to turn the program over to Dr. Matlock to share the highlights and key points of this paper. Thank you, Marty.
Thanks, Kent. We're going to move through this slide deck fairly fast. You can certainly request from CAST a copy of the slide deck. This is just simply a way to frame our conversation today. I'd like to move to questions and answers as soon as possible. So there we go. So again, I'd like to acknowledge the task force members. We had an incredible group of international authors who provided insights and guidance, as well as and a couple of those authors, Kurt and Yuan, are here with us today, as well as very generous reviewers who provided their expertise. Juan Tricarico with the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy was our liaison and helped keep us on track. These are labors of love, as Kent indicated. These are professional folks giving their time and energy without expectation of compensation or other remuneration. This is simply us working together to try to improve our conversation and our understanding. So what is LCA? It's defined by the ISO standard 14040 as a compilation and evaluation of inputs, outputs, and potential environmental impacts of a product system throughout its life cycle. Now, the life cycle is defined as consecutive and interlinked stages of a product, from material acquisition from the earth or generation from natural resources to final disposal. And as we look at circular economies, to reuse. Graphically, you can see that we go from raw material extraction all the way through to disposal or recycling, and perhaps to reuse of raw materials. So we take things from the ecosystem, we put things back into the ecosystem. I should probably change that to biosphere, because we're not just taking things from the biological, but also from the environmental components of the biosphere. LCA was developed really in the 1960s, we became more and more aware of our impact cumulatively on the environment. And so LCAs are heavily sort of steeped in environmental impacts, but we have emerging economic and social impact indicators as well. I want to make it clear from the outset, and this is one of our purposes for preparing this document, is that people make decisions. Life cycle assessments do not. Spreadsheet decisions based upon single numbers, are never sophisticated and rarely yield positive outcomes. Almost all of our decisions have unintended consequences because we're dealing with very complex systems. Normative or value-based decisions are ethical framings. Risk value judgments are made by people in the context of our laws, community norms, and social values. These are the most important decisions we make. The outcomes of an LCA cannot make this decision for you. What they can do is they can provide quantitative and risk-based assessments of the outcomes of the decisions. So they can give us better choices. For example, Sustainable Development Goals. We have 17 goals, 16 goals, and actually the 17th commitment for partnerships that humanity has embraced, from ending poverty to peace, justice, and strong institutions. These goals are sort of universally accepted as high values. The challenge we have is that they are in tension, and we have to make decisions sometimes to improve one goal at the cost of another. That's a clear example of a normative or value-based decision. What life cycle assessment can tell us is if we want to increase crop production to reduce hunger, and that requires increasing nitrogen fertilizer application and irrigation water use, what are the implications on life on land, life below the water, on climate? That's the sort of trade-off we see, and those are constant in our experience. So how is LCA used? To support broad environmental sustainability assessments by an organization, establish baseline information, rank relative contributions of individual steps or processes vis-a-vis environmental impacts and increasingly social impacts and economic impacts, identify gaps in understanding of data, to help guide product and process development, and to provide information and direction to decision makers and managers. There are two approaches to LCAs: attributional, which is the most common in my experience, and consequential. Now, attributional LCAs are really current or historic perspectives of a product system. They can assess minor changes in production or compare product systems. You replace one input with another. What are the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions or other energy use? They often require allocation between products from multiple output systems, which we'll talk about in a minute. Consequential life cycle assessments are becoming more common. They are forward-looking assessments. They evaluate the potential of environmental consequences of a decision contrasted with status quo. They require economic understanding of marginal products in the market, but avoid allocation. So these are the what ifs from a consequence. What if we change from this to that? What are the long-term consequences? An example of a consequential LCA would be the impact of use of a biodiesel on increasing demand for soybeans, for example, and then increasing demand for soybeans could result in increasing soybean production in countries with where land use change is the way to achieve that increased production. So it could result in loss of rainforest, for example, because of expansion of agricultural production in areas that that current land use is rainforest. That's a consequence of a decision. So those consequential LCAs are tricky. They're hard to They're emerging as a process, but we're getting better at them. LCAs are really composed of reference flows to quantified amount of product, parts, components, energy, mass necessary for products to deliver the performance described by the functional unit. The functional unit is the thing we care about. I would refer you to the overview of LCA processes available free of charge from the Danish Ministry of the Environment. Bo Weidema, one of the leaders in thinking internationally on LCA, the senior author of this and many other documents. So we've moved, this was a 2004 document. We started this work at the University of Arkansas some 20 years ago, Greg Thoma and I and a group of others on agricultural LCAs. And at the time, there was not a lot of guidance. And so, but over the last 20 years, as you've seen, we'll see here that this is a mature analytical process now. So reference flows are the starting point for building the necessary models for an LCA. Life cycle assessments really are a compilation of unit processes. Unit processes are the Lego blocks from which you build the life cycle system. The size of your Lego blocks depends on how much data you have for each of the processes and what you care about. Generally, when someone asks me what boundaries you should put on a unit process, my response is, what levers or knobs do you have to change? And if your unit process is not at least at the resolution of decision making, it is not adequately resolved. A unit process is just a system or part of a system that has inputs from other processes, outputs to other processes, inputs from nature, outputs to nature. You put these unit processes or Lego blocks together, and you end up with a reference flow, a model, a systems model linked together with reference flows. Now, reference flows are the flows of a particular mass or energy or process or component or impact through the system. And they are aggregated and accounted for and allocated through the system. An example of how this looks at the end, we did one of our first big LCAs was with the dairy industry. I think it was probably 15 years ago now, where we analyzed the 5 regions of dairy production in the United States for greenhouse gas emissions. We were looking at the fundamental questions: how much greenhouse gas emissions are encumbered by a gallon of milk? And so, first of all, we had to decide what a gallon of milk was. So we had to do, that's 2% fat allocation, for example. So we analyzed based upon all the inputs, regional-based inputs, the average feeds, and variability in feeds, production efficiencies, and then we have to allocate then beef, how much of that greenhouse gas emissions goes to beef, goes to cream. Then we have inputs from transport, processing, packaging, distribution, retail consumption. We come up with a total impact of 35 teragrams per year. Divide by the by the volume of milk, we come up with 17.6 pounds of CO2 equivalent per gallon. Actually, when we propagate uncertainty, which is a critical part of this, what we can really say is that we have 95% confidence for the time this analysis was conducted that the greenhouse gas emissions are encumbered by a gallon of milk would range from 15.3 to 20.7 pounds. So that's the way a life cycle assessment creates this sort of characterization of impact. How's it used in decisions? Well, if you care about global warming potential, do you want paper or plastic bags at the grocery store? Based upon the data, the sort of paper versus plastic has become a fairly well-established comparison in LCAs to show decision-making. If you only care about greenhouse gas emissions, global warming potential, then HDPE bag is clearly the choice, not paper, HDPE bag, and certainly not a polypropylene bag. So you see that you have, this is a simple way that we make decisions in LCA. It's never that simple because we never look at one metric. Monometric decisions are not sophisticated and not sufficient for most outcomes. They're going to lead to unintentional outcomes and bad decisions. Always think about the breadth of information and impacts when you're looking at a life cycle assessment. We have environmental product declarations and marketing are very common uses for life cycle assessment, especially in agriculture. And you have a whole range of environmental impacts alone, atmosphere, water, and earth, that you can analyzed. So if we look at these sort of global warming potential, ozone depletion, acidification potential, eutrophication potential, et cetera. So work we've been doing with poultry, for example, if we look at our reference flow, our process diagram with the dotted lines as the boundaries with inputs and outputs for poultry, you can see across these environmental impacts that we have a number of inputs that drive outputs. So acidification potential, predominantly ammonia emissions, really is a function of the house. And that's an example of how you can sort of focus in on what impacts matter and how you can address them. We have seen a proliferation of ISO standards for life cycle assessment from the 2006 14040 and 14044s to most recently the 14067 concerned for carbon footprint calculations. So we have a set of standardized methods now. LCA is no longer sort of a frontier analysis method. It's a standardized method, and it's not that complicated. It really is an accounting process. We start with goal and scope definition, inventory analysis, impact assessment with interpretation all the way through. But where we really start is in goal and scope definition, in defining why we're doing the work. The way an LCA is conducted depends on who the audience is and what you're going to decide about. And that's what makes taking a whole bunch of historical LCAs and pulling them together and doing some sort of comparison very difficult, because they're often performed for different reasons with different audiences and different decision-making criteria. And so when that happens, you're really comparing apples and cows, not even apples and oranges, and it makes it very difficult. So how the goal and scope change, how the goal and scope is defined really is a function of who it's conducted for: consumers, producers, policymakers, etc. Phase one goal and scope definitions start with the functional unit. It's the thing you care about. It's quantified performance of a product system for use as a reference unit. And there's a lot of examples from the functional unit of a diaper. What is it for? Versus paint, a gallon of paint. What is it for? So getting down to the functional unit is a key point. We don't have time really to dig into these details here, but there's significant guidance online now to help you define those. But make sure you get your functional unit defined properly. Systems boundaries define the unit processes to be included, the Lego blocks you need. Ideally, inputs and outputs are elemental at the boundaries, because that's what makes it a life cycle analysis. Go back to extraction. Ideal system boundaries are not always possible, though, because let me tell you, you never have enough data to do a full LCA of anything. And so the data we have is always compromised and always limited. Many processes yield more than one output. So we have co-products that share burdens through an allocation process. You can use economic or mass allocation. Waste treatment burdens are attributed to these co-products. So how do we allocate environmental impacts if a co-product is not used in our product system? That's very difficult. And this is an ongoing debate. Wilford et al. Published this article in Cleaner Environmental Systems this month. Allocation in LCA is still a point of debate and methodologies in many cases. This is a simple flow chart of overview of meat supply chain with all of its co-products and allocation challenges. So the question is, if we're just looking at greenhouse gas emissions for a hamburger, for example, you could take a look, and even at the beginning of this process, cereals. Well, to get the cereals to grain and straw for feed for the animals, you got to go, there's a whole set of life cycle assessments that go back to the extraction all the way back as well. And if we zoom into the abattoir, the slaughterhouse, and think of that as a unit process, then within that unit process, there are many elements too, from manure, wastewater treatment, organic waste treatment. There's cold chain, there's all the process of harvesting the animal, and then there's all the co-products and the storage of those products before they go to market. So each of these things become very complicated very fast just because of the detailed nature of what we do. ISO says that when you're allocating, you start with the underlying physical relationships, mass, energy, content. If this fails, then you can go to economic allocation, which is the most common next step. but it should be consistent throughout any process. Don't jump around. Don't do mass allocation and economic allocation within a same LCA. It makes no sense. Fortunately, again, we've had a global community of scholars working with FAO and LEAP and others in agriculture to create standardized sets of rules based upon what we've learned over the last 20 years. So for allocation rules for international standards for animal ag, I refer you to the LEAP standards that are still being developed across systems. I remind you that life cycle assessment really is about what we take from the environment, the biosphere, what we put back into the biosphere, and how it affects us and our processes. How it affects us and our processes can range from human toxicity to mineral extraction and all the stuff in between. These midpoint categories are proliferating as we have more data and more understanding. Then we can move to endpoint or sort of damage impacts for human health, ecosystem quality, climate change, resources, the so-called endpoints. Now we have higher confidence but lower understanding of the midpoint systems because they're closer to the original life cycle inventory data. Aggregating those to this sort of endpoints categories, we have lower confidence because there's much more uncertainty, much more variability. Now, some folks will move those endpoints to a single score. That is a pure judgment of normative values. Can be very useful within an organization, but that's just, how do you weigh human health versus ecosystem health? Do you give human health 0.6 and ecosystem health 0.4? That's a very subjective or normative decision process. And within the ISO standards, it's not allowed. So if you're moving to single score assessments for decision support, make sure you understand the criteria and that they align with your normative values. Agricultural LCAs are complex because we touch every part of the biosphere and the technosphere. For example, if you look at the IPCC description of nitrogen use, and you can see that it's extensive and broad and complicated. Data quality drives our effectiveness. We've all seen the standard dartboard precision versus accuracy. Primary sources of data are best directly from the entity that's driving whether it's the power plant or the coal mining process. Secondary sources of data are very common because that's usually extracted from and aggregated to some level. And we increasingly are using simulated data. And I know there's very high controversy over this, but the fact is, if I want to know what happens if I change all of US corn production from conventional to tillage practices to conservation tillage practices, I can't run that experiment. I have to simulate it. And simulating it generates the data that then support a life cycle impact assessment. Finally, again, I've said throughout, the guidance material is expanding globally. ILCD provides a number of handbooks too. These have been around for 5 to 10 years. The volumes, the massive information you need to understand life cycle assessment, part of the downside of the maturation of the process is the proliferation of information. But I would encourage you to take a look at the ILCD as well as the LEAP documents, and those should provide adequate guidance to get you on sound footing for your work and to support decisions. All right, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Kent.
Thank you, Dr. Matlock, for an excellent presentation. We've got a lot of questions coming in as we get those kind of put together and get them in front of our panel. I just wanted to share some information about some upcoming CAST activities, including some additional publication releases that we've got coming up in the first part of 2022. The first one is a paper on RNA interference technology in agriculture, looking at methods, application, and governance. The second one is a paper on the environmental, social, and economic impact of implementing sustainable intensification at scale. And the third one is a paper on animal agriculture and zoonosis, a One Health perspective. And again, these papers, similar to this one, are being put together by task forces made of a variety of experts across the fields. Information about these and all of our publications, the ones coming as well as ones that we released last year, is available through our website, and we'll be posting information about that through our social media channels. I encourage you to follow us on all those platforms to keep abreast of some of the new developments that we're doing at CAST. Now I'd like to introduce our panelist and a moderator for our discussion today. You've already met Dr. Matlock. Our other panelist is Dr. Yuan, an assistant professor of industrial ecology and sustainable systems at the Yale School of Environment. Her research is motivated by the increasing need for sustainable solutions that can help support industrial development without compromising the environment or depleting resources for the generations. Our next panelist is Dr. Kurt Rosentrater, the associate professor in the Department of Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering and Food Science and Human Nutrition at Iowa State University. His research focuses on improving the sustainability of biofuels, grain, feed, food, and agricultural-based systems. Our moderator for the Q&A panel discussion today is Dr. Juan Tricarico, Vice President of Sustainability Research for the U.S. Center for Dairy Research. His specials include dairy cow nutrition, feed and animal management, carbon footprint, enteric methane, and dairy supply sustainability. He's also a past president of CAS and serves on the board as the nonprofit liaison. Juan, thanks for serving as our moderator, and I'll turn the program over to you at this point.
Thank you very much, Kent. Thanks for the opportunity to have us today. I'm delighted to have the opportunity as well to moderate this question and answer session. We've got quite a number of questions coming in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with some what seem to be pretty straightforward questions. Many times they don't necessarily have straightforward answers. And then move on to some of the more general questions that we've seen come through the question and answer. If you haven't yet typed your question, please, I encourage you to do so at the moment. One of the questions basically says, in risk assessment, reference dose refers to a dose humans can be exposed to every day without expected health risks. Is a reference flow a similar idea? This is an allowable flow that would not cause harm to the environment, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. Thanks.
I'll jump in and say that no, they're similar but not the same, because a reference dose is a threshold, and a reference flow is just simply a movement of mass and energy through systems. It's an accounting of them. They're related in the sense that that you can account for the cumulative impact of mercury or exposure of mercury, for example, movement of mercury through a system and accumulated in a food to achieve if it exceeds a reference dose. But the reference flow is simply the movement of mass and energy through the system.
Thank you, Marty. The next question I'm going to ask is there ISO, I'm assuming standards, for dairy and beef farm analyses?
Not specifically, not ISO standards. That's why the LEAP, FAO LEAP standards have been developed. And so that's where you go to look for agricultural LCA framing and standards.
If I could add to that, if you search the published literature for beef production and life cycle assessment or dairy production and life cycle assessment, there are quite a few studies that have been published, and they all have different answers, or different results. So that's one of the challenges. What answer do you want?
Okay, we'll move on to the next one. How would you allocate to a byproduct?
The allocation rules are defined pretty clearly in ISO. If you can, you allocate based upon process mass. That's sort of elemental, starting with materials. As material moves through and a kilogram, 2 kilograms comes in, and a kilogram goes this way and a kilogram goes that way, they carry proportional burdens with them. If you can't do it that way, and there's a classic example is chicken. So you process a chicken, a live chicken comes in, and what goes out is chicken meat, chicken offal, heads and paws, and feathers. And so should you do a mass allocation there where you have about 60% meat, 40% offal and stuff, or should you do an economic allocation where the meat's the most valuable part and therefore should carry most burden? So those are the sorts of decisions you have to ask, and those are all based upon why you're doing the LCA. What decisions are you trying to make? Yuan, do you have a sense of that? This is really, it gets really difficult when you move, especially to more complex burdens besides greenhouse gas emission.
I can also add on that. So ISO also talk about, before you do allocation, if there's a way you can break down your system into smaller systems, where each smaller system, their burden can be directly linked to a specific byproduct, then you can avoid allocation. Or you can try to use system expansion, which means some of a byproduct can replace the other product in the market. Then you get some credit of doing that. That one will, of course, lead to a lot of uncertainty, because you will need to know what are those market equivalent products can be replaced.
So I am going to, thank you so much. I'm going to ask a couple of other specific questions that came out like this, but I'm assuming that most of our attendees are listening to all of these responses and realizing that there are no easy questions and easy answers, that everything basically depends on what was explained earlier today in terms of the purpose of LCA and how LCA is actually conducted. So the next one is about representation. And the question was posed as, how many producers have to provide data to represent a commodity?
Depends on how many you got. the data you get, the data you got. Representation is I mean, it's a statistical uncertainty associated with representation is a statistical characteristic and can be analyzed. If we have 720,000 cow-calf operators in the United States, how do we get representation of those to figure out what pasture management strategies have what impacts? That's the difficulty with agricultural LCAs, which are the most extensive. I mean, agriculture is the most extensive of human endeavors from a land use perspective, from a water use perspective. So it is the major conundrum we face. And that's why we almost always end up simulating rather than analyzing real data, because we rarely have enough data. The United States is the most data-rich country in the world for agricultural systems, because we have USDA is incredibly effective at collecting and sharing data. In many parts of the world, especially our European cousins, data are proprietary. They're collected by agencies or organizations, and if you want it, you have to pay for it. That changes everything.
Could I also add on to Marty's comments? You know, the flip side of that is, say, for example, biofuels. So the push in the push over the last several years has been low carbon fuels, and I think that push is going faster at the moment. And so, for example, if you are an ethanol plant and you want to sell your fuel products into a low carbon fuel market, then you have to essentially use a life cycle assessment tool that the state has provided to you. And they try to remove error by pre-populating all of the calculations. And you know, that's debatable whether that is good or not. But you know, that's what many of these low carbon fuel markets are doing, to sort of take the apples to cows comparison out and try to make plant A comparable to plant B, comparable to plant C. And so, you know, we've got this variety of scales, which makes it quite interesting working in the life cycle assessment field.
Great. The next question is, the LCA takes into account carbon sequestration?
If we have data, if we know what, yes, I mean, that's if you have a unit process, let's say soil in the agricultural production of corn, and if we know that a particular set of practices and activities and soil types result in a certain characteristics, we can include, as we look at the carbon reference flow, we can include sequestration in the soil as a part of that. But having the data is the key. We don't know anything about the process, we can't analyze it.
And even carbon sequestration from,
jump.
let's say a biofuels company who wants to sequester carbon either at their location or through a pipeline, there is no free lunch. There is going to be the construction cost, the operational cost, the energy it takes to actually compress that CO2. So those are all processes that will have to be accounted for if you're going to be doing a life cycle assessment for that.
Wonderful. I'm going to jump to the next one, which says, what did you mean when you said that the inputs are elemental?
Probably an inarticulate use of the frame. What I mean is the inputs should be as far back to extraction as possible. So
Wonderful.
if I'm looking at a traction system, a tractor on a field for tillage, I need to understand where the iron came from and what was used to extract the iron ore in the Iron Range of Minnesota or wherever, in order to and have some unit process flow of everything from that. I'll give you an example. We were working with a company 15 years ago that had a product, and they were seeing gold and mercury emerging in their product life cycle assessment. And the gold came from the circuitry in the equipment in their facility, and the mercury came from the production of the gold. And so that's the way you can see these sort of cumulative impacts that emerge, and they can be surprising. You don't know that they're in your supply chain when in fact they are.
Wonderful. We're going to start moving to some of the more general questions. One that was posed earlier on said, I firmly believe that goal and scoping and interpretation requires active engagement of stakeholders. Do you think this is reasonable? And how well do you think most LCAs score in that regard?
Yuan, you should answer that one. What do you think?
Well, in the ISO standard, they do say you need to consider the intended audience in the goal and scope. So you want to make sure you design your entire LCA project does answer the question that stakeholder care about. In reality, it may be hard to engage all the stakeholders at the beginning when people start to do the LCA. But if you look at those EPD, environmental product declaration, which are environmental labels that has to be done based on LCA, usually the first page, they will say who are the intended audience or stakeholder they think this LCA report can be useful.
It's also interesting when you think about goal and scope, you've got to be careful. When you talk about the ethics of research, the one example that comes to my mind is a company that came to me and wanted me to do a life cycle assessment to prove that their product was much more sustainable than their competitors. So, research, we never set out to prove this or that. We see where the data will take us.
Yeah, we test hypothesis.
Wonderful. I'm going to jump to another question that I believe can lead this conversation to a little bit deeper, and it's about gaps. What can be done to get better information to the research and make better decisions?
We are standardizing data collection and reporting systems. The National Ag Library has been working for over a decade to try to standardize agricultural life cycle inventory data. So we have to have an ontology and naming of things so that we put things in the right categories. I cannot tell you how many times we have struggled with simple units, whether we're talking about metric versus non-metric units. It's and not understand. If they're not indicated in the database, you have to extrapolate or not use that reference flow. And those broken reference flows are a nightmare in these systems. So we need and this is the reason the LEAP program is so valuable. The LEAP program created an international framework for data for agricultural, especially animal ag data. So the FAO LEAP and hundreds of scientists and practitioners who have contributed to that are heroes in this space. Oh, Juan, you're muted, Juan.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm going to jump to the following question. Is life cycle costing better for assessing the impacts of co-products?
No, but it's sometimes all you got. I mean, as we said, the economic allocation is not as good as primary sort of reference flow allocation based upon mass, based upon characteristics, but sometimes it's all you've got. And sometimes depending on why you're doing the LCA, it makes sense. Again, I'm talking too much. I really, Dr. Yao, you've been dealing with allocation challenges very recently. How do you see this?
I'm actually not sure whether this question is talking about economic allocation or refers to the life cycle cost analysis.
Ah, see, that's why, yes, that's a different kind of life cycle assessment. Yes.
Yeah. So life cycle cost analysis still borrow the concept of life cycle thinking, but they are looking at the economic indicators like the production cost or some other indicator that related to the economic implication to tell you whether this product going to the market make economic sense or not. So they are looking at different impact compared with the environmental life cycle assessment that we are talking about now.
And something else that adds a really interesting flavor, especially in the agricultural world, when you're talking about commodities that have fairly rapid price fluctuations, that adds another layer of challenge, because how do you do the economic allocation if the price point is changing every couple of days or every week or so, depending on what the commodity is?
Many questions came through relative to allocation. Obviously, it was pointed out during the presentation that that was a particularly challenging topics. In some instances, people are asking specific questions about their, their sectors or sectors that they're interested in, and many of the questions are asking about byproducts, and allocation questions relative to byproducts. So instead of going through the list and asking them individually, I would like to ask the panel here to maybe throw out, put out there for all of us, some general recommendations on how would you approach the challenge of allocation when you have to conduct an LCA to test the hypothesis, and you know that you're going to have quite a variety of different byproducts as a result of the flow of energy and mass in the system you're trying to describe.
I'll start with, in our animal ag analyses, we use a mass allocation because a kilogram of this or that carries with it, for example, nitrogen loads and nitrogen impacts, nitrogen emissions. So we use a mass allocation approach for the reference flows, and we try to stay with that consistently throughout. And that means there's significant misunderstanding that because if you're raising cattle for hamburger, and look at the whole supply chain from cow-calf operation through product consumption, the manure part of that doesn't seem to, it seems like that often should be considered a waste or byproduct. Well, it is a product, it is a part of the process of producing that thing at the end, that functional unit that you care about. And it is just as much a part of it as the bone, as the muscle, as the other parts. It is part of it. And so mass is the best way based in most cases. That's my experience. And the fact is, one of the questions asked about distillers, dry distillers grain, the fact that DDGs are produced in a fairly intensive process of fermentation and then drying to make ethanol. And there's an attitude, there's sort of a perception that because you're making ethanol with them, the ethanol is the reason for the DDGs that should carry most of the burden. except for the fact that's just not the case. The DDGs are just a massive material moving through, and ethanol comes off and DDGs come off through this process. So we have to be agnostic about the values of, and from a claims perspective, and focus on the process allocation from a mass energy flow perspective. That's my assessment. I really am interested in Dr. Yao's and Dr. Rosentrater's perspective.
Yeah, I can go next. So Marty, in his slide, he talked about the attributional LCA and the consequential LCA. So for attributional LCA, that means we are really interested in understanding the environmental burden specifically attributed to one or two different products. And in that case, we have different allocation options like mass, energy, whatever. So there's one option is if your goal is to really compare the environmental burden of your product with a lot of other products, we also have LCA available. You could check what are the common allocation methods you use, and you try to use a consistent one to make sure your result can be compared to theirs. Or if you couldn't decide, I always suggest to do a sensitivity analysis, that you try several different options to see if you try different options, whether your total conclusion will flip or not. If there will not be flip, you have consistent conclusions, congratulations. If not, then you can highlight in your result discussion, say, note that our conclusions are really subject to the modeling choices on allocation. But if you want to do a consequential LCA, which means you want to understand what are the net consequences of your entire system. If you do some changes, like you implemented a totally new advanced technology and then changes your output, changes your byproduct. In that case, many times people may do the system expansion, which means you need to figure out what are those marginal products that could be changed, caused by small change of the demand, caused by introduce the byproduct from your system. That could be very, very complex. You may need an economist to help you figure out how to do that. Then choose the best way to deduct the burdens associated with the product, replace the by your byproduct. So that's my recommendations.
And I will throw, and I'll, just to second what both Marty and Yuan had to say, working with biofuels or whiskey, 6 of one, half a dozen of another, vodka or whiskey, similar kind of things, intensive fermentation. But the interesting thing about the processing of cereal grains into alcohol, it depending on the company, you look at this company or a different company, it's pretty common, the mass conversions of a grain into alcohol or a grain into distiller's grains. And so the mass fluctuations aren't that great. But if you look at sales price, for example, of the distiller's grains, you're talking about fluctuations up to $200 per metric ton within a matter of 1 to 2 weeks on average. And so to do an economic allocation really, I think, does not do the system justice. I mean, if you want to do economic allocation, that's great, but your values are going to change rapidly. So the mass allocation is not. And so that's going to be much more consistent in terms of results.
But I really like Yuan's approach to the sensitivity analysis, because it tells you if it matters how you allocate. Because sometimes if it just doesn't matter, if it doesn't change the outcome by more than 2%, then you pick the one that makes them, that you have the most data for, that you have the least variability for, that makes the most sense to your stakeholders, and you move forward. But sensitivity analysis is not easy, and it's time intensive.
Wonderful, thank you. I appreciate everything that was said on such a difficult topic as allocation. Now I'd like us to focus on a question here that I'm going to change a little bit as well. And it's basically, what do you do when you have various LCAs on the same or similar topics and they all disagree?
But they rarely disagree, they mostly differ. There's a difference between disagreeing and differing. And so the fact is systems are variable and analytical methods reflect that variability. So in some ways, if I wanted to know, for example, what is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a liter of biofuels ethanol, of corn-produced ethanol, I could come up with 30 to 50 LCAs that have a range of numbers. That's a form of a sensitivity analysis, as long as there's no real outlier in methodology and allocation. And some of those are just really reflecting the differences of the data used, the resolution of time, when the analyses were performed, the technology of the time, or even going back to what data were used to inform what the energy source was for the distillery plant. Was it predominantly a sort of an Iowa electric pool, or was it Western Washington State, which is predominantly a hydropower electric pool? So those power pools matter in informing how much greenhouse gases are implemented or carried through in the reference flows. So you consider those differences. Both God and the devil live in those differences, and that's what you have to understand. They're really valuable. They teach us about the system and its variability, and you embrace them. You don't shy from them.
Yeah, I agree. I think the key is to really to understand why they differ, why they have different results. Like in the energy LCA field, people have been trying to do the harmonization study to try to like all the different assumptions, different parameters people use across different LCA for different energy technology. Then they try to get data from different paper and use the same parameters, same assumption to see at that level, what are the factors that are really causing changes or differences. So I agree with Marty. We need to understand what are those reasons behind those differences, rather than just try to argue with each other and don't agree with each other.
Thank you very much for that. I noticed that we are getting close to the end of our allotted time. So I want to ask basically a final question that I think I would like to hear from every single one of you speakers. It's a question from a graduate student researcher at the University of District of Columbia. The question is, how do you expect the proliferation of LCA analyses to change global industry, resource extraction, and decision-making? Will social LCA be prioritized along with environmental and economic LCA?
I think you just described your career, mapped out your career for analyzing and implementing LCAs. So it's a good grad student question. Social LCAs are still emerging. We've been working with them for, United Nations have been working on social LCA for indicators and approaches for 10 years now. It's not new. They are in some ways, from an enterprise reputational risk perspective, some of the most important metrics. The challenge is data, access to data, availability of data. The simplest social LCA type data are economic values, employment, and the impacts of employment, and the others are health impacts on workers, health impacts on people from an extractive environment who are in the region. But so I think it's the most important frontier for LCA for decision-making support, especially for any global supply chain enterprise. If you're going to protect your reputation, avoid bad things.
I can add one more thing. So we don't have ISO standard for social LCA, but United Nations does publish a guideline for social LCA that can be the first-hand material many times people want to consult to when they want to do a social LCA. I agree with Marty. The key challenge is the data, especially this is the emerging type of the LCA.
I would add, maybe this is not an LCA approach, but when we see the major trends in companies, not just in the US, but globally, in terms of ESG reporting, environmental impacts, social impacts. I think what we're seeing is companies more interested at the moment with the carbon reporting, but I think this is growing into also the social. So I think consumers are changing in terms of what they expect from companies. And so I think that it's not really an LCA approach, but it is a reporting approach. And I think we're going to see companies accelerate their ESG reports and the types of information and the transparency they have as companies.
Thank you so much to all our panelists for addressing these questions, and thank you so much as well to everybody that submitted questions through the chat and the QA button in Zoom. We usually address the questions that we didn't get to, and so please stay connected. This is the beginning of this conversation, and it's an exciting one. Thanks again, and I'll turn it over to Kent.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you for your role in moderating this discussion. I'd like to add my thanks to all of the panelists and all the other authors who were part of this. One thing in my introduction of Dr. Matlock, I omitted that I wanted to highlight before I had a chance, that he is also a past winner of our Borlaug-Cass Communication Award. And we're very pleased to continue that award. And for those that may be considering applications, I think February 7th is our closing deadline for this year's application. So you know, if somebody who's an outstanding communicator around the food science technology of agriculture, please feel free to get those entries in. And Dr. Matlock, thank you for the work that you do in that area. The paper that it was referenced today in our discussion is available online at our CAS website. Please feel free to download it, as well as the quick cast and other resources, as we alluded to, recording this video and the PowerPoint presentation. We'll be sharing that as well. So be looking for those over the next couple of days as we get all of that information posted. And the information, if you had a specific question to one of our panelists, please feel free to follow up with them. Thanks again for being part of today's webinar. We hope you enjoyed the presentation and learned more about this topic, and we'll be sharing information with you soon about our next webinar. Thank you and have a good day.